Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Reggie Ratliff, the host of Let's Talk Maywood on Diversity Today Media. I pray that everyone is having a good year so far, this Black History Month. Let's talk about it, as well as other things related to Maywood news. And joining me on this podcast is my co-host, my co-laborer in the vineyard, and expert financial advisor, Terrence Hollingsworth. Terry, what's going on, bro?
Yo, how's
Is it
everybody doing?
chilling? Like literally chilling.
You ain't lying. All over the country, they
Man,
chilling.
I hear in Northern Virginia, all of last week school was closed. All of it, I mean, the entire week. And, we had a big snowstorm like a little over a week ago. It was on a weekend, like on a Friday. They closed, there was no wrestling tournaments or nothing on Saturday. Of course, nothing on Sunday. Monday, they did a cold blue, whatever. No school, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. Because we don't have the equipment out here like back home.
Yeah,
We have the trucks and the salt and that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of hills out here compared to back home. So that was safety issues with bus driving, transporting kids. And a lot of these sidewalks are, covered with snow and ice. So it turned to ice. So I was at home, working out the best I could. I went up to school a couple of times. But now we're back in school, So I'm excited. Wrestling season.
yeah. So I want to say two things about wrestling. One, I want to ask you how your team did, but I also want to say that if you guys notice, her name is Day Day Watson. She's a girl Iowa wrestler, 130 pounds, and remarkable story. She was a wrestling manager in November. She won the state tournament in February. Right?
Wow. First year wrestling?
No, she wasn't first year wrestler. She
Okay.
wrestled as a kid, but then when she got to high school, she wasn't feeling wrestling, man. She
Right.
didn't want to wrestle no more. So,
Wow.
she was playing volleyball and basketball and all these other things. And,
Right.
late in the season, she decided she was going to just go ahead and, close out her senior year. And she
That's
closed it out with
bananas.
a state championship.
That's what's up. Our
Yeah.
team is doing good. It's my first year at this high school, Garfield High School. We had four wrestlers on the boys' side who qualified as an individual or alternate. So four altogether, which is more, I guess, over the last 20 years, I was told. So, a lot of the wrestling room was full all year, and that was a good sign. We got a young team. So next year it's going to be more experience and more cohesiveness, and they're going to do better. We finished in the top 10 in the regionals, which is equivalent to like the sectionals in Illinois.
Yeah.
But it was our highest finish since the 2005 season. Like, that's crazy to me. Like, are you serious? Proviso we be in the top 10 like every year,
That's right.
So they hugging each other and everything. I was like, I'm happy, I'm happy. It's progress, And then we got the girls wrestling regionals coming up this weekend on Sunday and Monday. So we got 16 girls on the roster, which is like one of the highest number of girl wrestlers in the entire state of Virginia. So very proud of them for sticking through it and doing their best. And I'm going to predict 4 state qualifiers for
Nah,
the girls.
that's good stuff. You tell your team coming from the state of Iowa, which is
Yeah,
a Dan Gable quote, wrestle hard and make your own luck.
that's hey, I love that. I love that. I'll tell them that. I will tell them. So what's going on? It's a lot happening, man. Here in early 2026. What stands out most for you, Terry?
So the
Environment.
probably the biggest thing is that, you know, steady as they go, as they say, right? The biggest influence on portfolio performance is not diversification, it is sector rotation. And so what we see is the market leaders, which was technology last year,
Yeah.
those are not leading the market this year. You
Mm.
got some international, in particular, Japan is doing well. And so, it comes down to just having discipline in the way that you invest and your outlook. And that discipline is putting money to work. And over time, guess what? You're going to be just fine.
Mhm.
If we're capturing the market, at the end of the day, what do we call it? Robotics AI, they're
Yeah,
still going to dominate the market over the next
absolutely.
5 years.
Absolutely.
So you have to have some exposure there, and that is in data centers, that's in storage,
Oh my God.
that's
Yeah.
electricity, and of course, the semiconductors, Nvidia, some of those companies. If you have them, you're going to do good over the next 5 to 10 years, and I say good, I mean exceptionally good.
Right.
So
Well, I want to ask you, there was a major layoffs with Amazon. Is that correct?
yes.
And recently, we're going to talk with, I guess, Trustee Jones about the Kroger fulfillment center closing because they want to reshape their e business structure. So they close a lot nationwide. But with these closings, how do you think that's going to impact our nation and as well as locally with the Kroger closing?
I don't think that anybody really knows, to be honest, but this is the thing that I talked about, right? If you go back and watch some of our older shows, I said Maywood has to address high speed internet, and I think it has to go from every home and business in the community because AI requires it, right? And if they don't address it, or if they didn't address it, Kroger was going to close anyway
Mm-hmm.
because manufacturing is replacing humans with robotics and things like this. That's a harsh reality.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon said they want to replace 600,000 workers by
Yeah.
2030. They're the second largest employer in the United States and
Mm-hmm.
across the world. And
Yes.
so it is something that we have to deal with, not only in Maywood, but in Iowa and all across the country.
Mm-hmm.
As an investor, again, we want to benefit it from as investors, but as people in our communities, we have to deal with it and make sure that we put the infrastructure in place so that we can be competitive and draw businesses into our communities, which ultimately helps the workforce.
Indeed. So there were a loss of jobs. Of course, those are impacted. But we saw things slightly changing. If you look at the toll roads,
Yeah,
people were being laid off. If you look at the grocery stores, with self checkout, cashing your own things out. So we started to see things starting to take place. But now we're starting to take place at a really high rate. So long term, do you think that we'll be okay as a nation economically, or do you think it's going to just change the industries and maybe
it
lose
is.
it?
It's certainly going to change how we adapt. I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, right?
Fair,
Because on one hand, you're talking about replacing labor, but if you replace labor, how does the economy and the communities function without people working, right?
mm-hmm.
Elon Musk famously said not that long ago, we're going to get to a point where universal income is a necessity, and how can you argue that
Right,
when we're laying off people and yet people's rent need to be paid,
right,
grow, they need to buy food, they need to buy cars, and those are the engines on our economy. If you don't have those working, you don't have a stock market working, you don't have anything
right.
working.
Trickle down effect, domino
Yeah.
effect, for sure. Well, we're going to talk to our guest. Like I said, Trustee Jones is going to come on in any moment, and we're going to talk about the Kroger fulfillment center closing, its impact on Maywood, and the next steps. We talk about strategic plan, and so I'm going to ask him about that. What's the plan? What is the contingency plan?
Yeah, I'm gonna get out of the way because I'm interested to hear his thoughts, and it's an inside out conversation because he's privy to things that we're not privy to, and even though we probably won't give details on certain
Right,
things,
right.
outlook is still gonna be the same.
I'm
This
still going
is
to
really
ask. I'm going to ask. That's what I do. I ask. He might
all
not tell
right,
me, but I'm going to ask. But yes.
right.
Well, all
So
right, brother.
I'm out, but you guys, it was nice. Happy 2026. I look forward to
Indeed.
talking more about what we do. Let's talk Maywood and finance. So see you
Indeed.
later.
All right, bro. Peace. So, as previously mentioned, our guest is Village of Maywood trustee Miguel Jones. He's not a stranger to this podcast. He willingly comes on. He's very transparent when we talk about certain issues, especially sensitive issues that impact the village of Maywood. He has nothing to gain. He is just sharing knowledge and information with his constituents and the residents in the village of Maywood. And I think rightly so. And so we appreciate that. And so without further ado, I'd like to bring on Trustee Miguel Jones. How you doing, sir? Trustee Jones.
Dr. Ratliff, it's good to see you. Thanks for having me on again.
It's good to be seen, man. It's good to see you as well. Happy 2026 for you.
Yes, sir. You as well. Happy Black History Month.
Black History Month indeed. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask you, what does Black History Month mean to you? What is significance for you growing up in the area we grew up and attending Walter Lutheran and all? How's it impacted you?
Yeah, so it's very important. I live in a predominantly Black and brown community where there have been a lot of leaders that have led in the civil rights movement, that have come from our community, that have made tremendous progress, whether it be, through the Black Panther Party, whether it be in real estate, whether it be in the sciences. I think about the Percy Julians, and I think about the Sheila Crump Johnsons and the Fred Hamptons of the world. I think about the Chris Welches and, the Kimberly Lifers that have made a lot of progress, who are people that have been local to our community. So from that perspective, it means a lot. But just from a national perspective, when I think about Carter G. Woodson and the efforts that he did, back in the 40s to start Black History Week, that eventually transcended to Black History Month. Yep. And, acknowledging the progress and the accomplishments and the history of Black Americans and our story. So I think we all just need to take a moment to reflect on those things, to continue to promote our school districts and our educational systems to, educate our students, not just our Black students, but all of our students, because Black history is American history.
Indeed.
But, also taking onus from a family perspective, that's something that we have to make important in our own homes. So we can't completely rely on educators and television to do that, but we have to take onus in our families to make sure that we are continuing those efforts, and that, Black history is being created as we speak. Yeah. And so, encouraging young folks to get an education, to stay on top of things, whether it be how the world is changing with, AI and, with the economy, with politics, participating. This world is a global world, but it's also a world where you have to participate in order to take advantage. So being prepared, I think, and being aware so we don't repeat certain mistakes, but then we also can learn from the strides that we have made in order to move forward in the best way possible.
Very well said. I'm a high school educator, and I tell my students they're working on a research paper, the internal assessment for the IB business program. And so they're using TikTok and Instagram as sources. I'm like, no, what are you doing? No, I understand it's something you watch with videos and things like that, but you need to know your history. You need to do your research that's credible, reliable, and to contribute. So it's that delicate balance between, as we mentioned in the pre-podcast, technology and the benefits and the liabilities of it, and being able to use that technology in a tangible way for conducting research. So we have our foot in it, as Black history shows in many different areas, from Lattimore, the light bulb, the filament, to make sure that the light bulb work, and the ironing board. I mean, just so many contributions we've made. The light switches from red to green, vice versa. So technology has always been in us and in our community. But when we take a deeper dive and we look at the scope of Maywood and see where we are, we see Black history taking place. You mentioned quite a few names, and not to forget, the Jim Brewer, and so many others who contributed.
Joe Freeland.
Joe Free had the first Black mayor of Maywood, my best mayor ever. He He did so much for the community. You know, he was elected in the early 80s. He was an educator himself. He was a principal, you know, a Second Baptist Church, you know, and a deacon. I mean, his wife was part of Maple Tree, was the director of Maple Tree Learning Center. I mean, so many stories that we can share. But here we are with you being part of that history now as a trustee with an ever-changing environment locally. And we look at the political landscape in Maywood, which is vastly different than 40 years ago. And it's still evolving, but yet you're able to keep track of that. That's why I love when you come on, so you can talk about the evolution of Maywood politically and from a business standpoint, which takes me to Kroger, the fulfillment center. They came to Maywood a few years ago, and in the blink of an eye, they're gone. So what's the backdrop of the story, Trustee Jones, as it relates to Kroger in this beginning and subsequently its ending?
Yes. So Kroger came to the community mid-year 2022 under the leadership of, at the time, it was this gentleman named Rodney McMullen, who was the CEO of Kroger. And so at the time, they were looking to merge with Albertson. And so they were making developments or, they were making strides to make their case. And at the time, they had invested in several fulfillment centers, not just in Maywood, but across the country. And so those investments were made. The village and the state of Illinois supported those efforts with the promise and the idea that it would be job creation and it would be an economic boom. And so the village did what I think we should have done and the state did and took advantage of it. And when you're in a situation like Maywood, in order to be competitive, you have to, or you should highly consider giving incentives to incentivize businesses like a Kroger or some of these large entities that come to your community. So fast forward, that merger does not happen. And that CEO was ultimately resigned in 2024, and a gentleman named Ron Sargent became the interim CEO, and the strategy changed. There's been a couple things happened. One, we got a new president since 2022. The cost of living has increased. Grocery prices have increased. There has been a huge investment into AI, and stockholders are looking to still be profitable. And so there was a decision made by Kroger a couple months ago to shut down different fulfillment centers. And unfortunately, Maywood, amongst quite a few, at least 3 or 4 that I can, name probably off the top of my head, one in, Florida and Wisconsin, and I believe in Oklahoma, that have also shut down, have impacted local communities. And it's unfortunate. And, I'm here to kind of talk about what I know and what the village's, or at least my perspective is on it, and ultimately how we can move forward.
So Trustee Jones, thank you for laying the landscape and the background information for the pending merger that did not happen, and how it, in a, I guess, minute way, impacted Maywood. But Maywood, as far as number of residents, is a minute community compared to those other towns where Kroger was, where they opened and ultimately closed. And you mentioned something that has been near and dear, and I've repeated this several times in our conversations on the podcast: strategy. The strategy changed. So my question is, what is Maywood's strategy? Has it changed? Is there a strategic plan that would show changes in the event that a Kroger would close its doors or any other businesses?
Well, so Maywood's strategy ultimately is to look for investment and to earn the most tax revenue, whether it be property taxes, sales taxes, etc. Now, the village is a municipality, so we're not in the private business of, we don't own that. We sold that property to developers. And so our goal is a property that is dilapidated, not being used. If we're going to invest in that property, the hope is that whoever owns it and ultimately leases it, in this case, it was Kroger, that they would stay for the duration of their lease, for the duration of the tax incentive that was given. And with the hope that once that tax incentive is over with, that we would be able to recoup our full, our full tax, amount, which is about 25% for those type of entities. And so from a private business perspective, their strategy changed, but our strategy didn't. We're still in the business. Maywood is still open for business. And so, our goal now is to, from my perspective, is to ensure that property does not turn back dilapidated, does not turn into a eyesore. And so there's a couple things that we need to be thinking about. One, Kroger leased the property. So there's still private owners that own the property. And when someone leases a property, they essentially, becomes a tenant, they signed a contract. In this case, Kroger, I believe, had a 10-year contract. Now, when you break a lease, there are fees for you ultimately breaking the lease. The same way if you rent an apartment and you break a lease, if you sign an apartment for a year and you want to break the lease, there's something in that lease that's going to say what happens when you do that. And so Kroger, I haven't seen the lease, and that's something that our community, economic development entity will need to work with those owners to find out more details. But when you break a lease, there's going to be a couple things that are triggered. One, there's some sort of fee that the landlord is going to want to insure because they're going to have costs still. They still are on the hook for property taxes, to, maintenance and, other costs. So that usually is very significant and should be able to cover the cost of the property taxes while the owner is looking for another tenant. The other thing that usually happens is you have to return that building back to what they normally call a white envelope or a box structure, where it's basically, like drywall or brick, but you have to usually remove that equipment out of there. That's normally on the lessee, in order to do that cost. And so from a village perspective, our job is going to be able to partner and work with that landlord for them to understand our zoning requirements, what type of businesses can fulfill that space, help them in whatever ways we can to ensure that this doesn't become a nuisance and that we can ultimately attract another tenant that would be able to not only move in, but be sustainable. So my observation is, what can the village do to avoid, because Maywood has had a lot of businesses in our community that ultimately have left, but what you don't want to happen is where it's vacant for 5-10 years, the landlord ends up leaving, and so all of a sudden they're not paying property taxes anymore. So the first thing is to hold the line, right? And to ensure that, okay, let's make sure we're still collecting property taxes. Let's make sure that the owner has the resources it needs to look for another tenant. And from there, we need to be thinking about what that's going to look like for the village. And then also learn, having takeaways. So in some ways, this was out of the village's hand. This was a Kroger decision. This was a huge company. It's the largest traditional grocer in the country. However, it isn't the largest grocer. The largest grocer is Walmart, just as a caveat. It's from a market share perspective. Right. But Kroger is the largest traditional grocer. And so those are big shoes to fill. But they're the good news is the village, the investment that we did make, now we have a building that is move-in ready. So it's not going to take the state to make such a huge investment again, because we've already done that. So that building is move-in ready. So that's going to be more appealing to a tenant where they're not going to have so much capital costs or as much capital costs as they would, or from the perspective of if the building was not, up to par. So our job is to have a soft landing with this, ensure that the owner and, get some sort of commitments that the property taxes are still going to be paid going through the future, in the near future. And then from there, ensuring that we can get a tenant in that space. Not only does it help the village, but it protects the landlord as well.
Sure. And how long was the lease? I'm not sure if you mentioned it. How long was the lease that Kroger had with the village?
I believe it was 10 years.
10 years. I think you mentioned that. Okay. And how much was the land sold for to this investor?
So the investor that owns it now wasn't the original investor. The original investor got the program for about $10,000 back in 2020 or 2019, I believe, or so. It was either 2019 or it was several years ago. But the reason why it was tied to this redevelopment agreement, and again, going back to communities like Maywood that have been under investment, if you're looking for huge multi-million-dollar investments, you have to be competitive. Otherwise these large companies, because they're focused on the bottom, they're just going to go somewhere else or to another community that is willing to subsidize. So it was originally sold for $10,000. It won't be sold for $10,000 now. That's a multi-million-dollar facility at this point. And so it has changed hands since then. And so we'll have to work with the new owners to understand, really, it's going to be their strategy as far as getting a new tenant. Maywood's role is to help facilitate that. So they understand what we're looking for, how this, fits into our strategic plan, what type of entities are allowed in that space, and going from there.
I'm assuming that the property has been appraised since 2019 to determine how many millions of dollars that it's worth, because you use that based on your property taxes, right? You pay a portion of the value of the land.
Yeah, so that's typically what you do from a residential perspective. Commercial properties it's a combination of that, but it's also based on figures as it relates to profit, revenue generating for that property is also where property taxes are generated. So property taxes that we've collected as recently as this most recent tax year, the village was receiving about $12,000. And so they are current on their property taxes, and that's going to be our goal now. But that isn't the only impact.
Right.
Those drivers of the fulfillment center were also getting gas in the community. They were having lunch.
Yeah.
In some cases, for the individuals that were, lived in Maywood, paying mortgages and property taxes.
There was money flowing in the community.
Yeah. So, it was an economic impact. And so that's also unaccounted for in a lot of ways right now, that we're going to be looking to, or that's going to be what we're encouraged to make sure we get another tenant. But, I guess I wanted to just throw out there that just because the lessee, in this case Kroger, left, it's not just like, okay, gloom and doom that we're not going to be collecting property taxes. That owner is still going to be liable for that, and through breaking that lease, they should be getting a huge investment from Kroger. And typically you have to pay several years. So if you have a 10-year lease and you break it at year 3, normally you have to pay, from my experience, you have to pay, I would think 4 or 5 years of rents that you were owed to that landlord. And so that's where the village needs to come in and understand what their strategy is, so they don't take that money and just run with it. And from an appraisal perspective, typically that comes from the owner of the property that's gonna do those type of appraisals. Although the Cook County assessor will make an assessment of properties, but an actual appraisal typically happens from the owner.
Understood. So the question I have is related to loss of assets, particularly this land, because we don't own the land.
Correct.
And now they're making money hand over fist over this investment. And I understand the dilapidated property, that kind of the dry building or whatever came after that, it was empty. The build was empty. So I understand the difficult decision of selling land. But there were 75 employees? I understand. Is that correct number? 75 from Maywood?
Yes. Yep.
So what is the short and long-term economic impact to the village as you stated, as far as other businesses being impacted? What do you have that been a discussion amongst the board related to that?
Yeah, so this is a new development. Our expectation is that Kroger, whether it be through severance packages or through other means, are going to help to transition these employees and help support them with this with this transition of being unemployed, approving unemployment, and helping them get those type of resources and needs to the degree in which we've quantified exactly what's going to be the total impact, again, to other businesses and to property values in that area, et cetera. That's to be determined. We are going to be very interested because the village is now having conversations about things like TIF districts. Mm-hmm. These type of things impact what you expect to be the long-term growth of your community and what you would hope to reap in the event you do move forward with something like this. And it also, just from the economic development community, I think has a big impact into consumer confidence and willingness to invest. So again, I wouldn't put the burden completely on the village, because at the time there was a CEO and they had their and I think I mentioned the gentleman's name was Rodney McMullen at the time when this investment came in. Most recently, even though I just saw reports today that a gentleman named Greg Foran from Walmart is now going to be the CEO as of yesterday for Kroger. But okay. Ron Sargent at the time is, under his leadership, is the one that made the call in order to divest a lot of these fulfillment centers, as you mentioned, to essentially, reduce costs, take a huge loss on their books, but then also to utilize different e-commerce avenues to save money. And so typically when companies do that, not always, but usually it wasn't profitable in some ways over a short term. But something I wanted to also talk about too with the village is something that we need to think about as far as other investment. Yes, the merger did have an impact. I won't say that it didn't, but the reason why the FCC declined that merger from their eyes is, one, because of antitrust law or antitrust issues or concerns about having too much of a market share, anti-competition laws of having too much of a market share, because Kroger being the second largest and Albertsons being the fourth largest. So how I rank, just so people know, in the grocery market, top 5, it'll go Walmart 1, Kroger 2, Costco 3, Albertsons 4, and Sam's Club 5. Those are the top 5 in terms of grocers in the country. And so 2 and 4 were looking to merge. And from their analysis, that was going to be an antitrust or it was going to make the market in a way where it would impact salaries and price, because it was lack of competition. And so I believe had that merger happened, we would have seen even more reduction, because what happens is now you have, when those companies come together, now you have double everything. So you don't need 2 CEOs, you don't need 2 CFOs, and then it just kind of trickles down. And so we would have seen even more reductions and things of that nature. But also the reason why these things happen, and I mentioned, initially when this deal happened, this was about 2022. Mm-hmm. Since then, grocery costs have went up. Yeah. Inflation in general, the cost of living has went up. Mm-hmm. There's been a huge push for AI, artificial intelligence. And I want the community to be aware of this because we've been talking about bringing the grocery store into our community. In particular, Living Fresh has been the conversation for a while. And back when we signed a letter of intent with Living Fresh, this was maybe 3-4 years ago, the economy was in a different state. And so I believe was Living Fresh. Last summer, Living Fresh had a campaign because of, looking to sustain their business in Forest Park. It wasn't doing well.
Right.
So what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this? One of the lessons is we don't want to be short-sighted, and we don't want to be naive to the investment that it takes. But also, I mentioned the 5 largest grocers in the country. They're going to be able to get the best pricing. They're going to be able to have the best logistics. So that impacts costs. I think a smaller grocer could survive, maybe a Tony's or, maybe a Pete's, et cetera. But we have to be cognizant of, can this entity survive within this market? And also because you're also going to be asking consumers to change their spending habits. So everyone goes to a certain grocery store. Everyone shops the way they shop. The reason why Walmart is doing so well is because it's a one place. It's full service retail, and we're in a convenience space. So the Village of Maywood we have some challenges because 5th and Washington, we don't have that robust retail space where it's that one-stop shop.
Right.
And so we have to be very cognizant of especially because there's going to be incentives involved in this. Is that the best use of of taxpayers' dollars? If Kroger says this isn't profitable, or likely wasn't profitable, or had challenges and pulled out, then we have to use this as a case study for other entities that are going to have employee costs, that are going to have, utility costs, and, capital investment. It's going to take several $1 million to get that store up and running. Although we do have state commitment to help support that, so did Kroger. And so we have to just use that as a case study to ensure, is this the right scope of work? Does it make sense? Because the village isn't looking just for a onesie, twosie year investment and then they leave, right? So I say all that to say is that's how the village can respond to this, is making sure future investments, we're doing our homework.
Yeah. And
that's for the board to do, but also for staff to do, and asking those questions, and also understanding that things change from 2022. We're in it's 2026 now.
Right.
So we have to understand, are the financials still the same? What are these entities' financial position? What's the village's financial position? And going from there.
You mentioned something that was, and I appreciate the explanation and the details. You definitely know what you're talking about from an economic perspective, not just economic, but economic development perspective, because that's very important, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's all about economic development. Is also not just about the local economy, but the regional appeal. Grocery stores in particular don't survive because of one village. They survive because you have a regional appeal. And that's it. So whatever grocery store that we have, it's also about scale too. Yep. What type of numbers do they need to hit? So in some ways, I believe Maywood, from my personal perspective, I believe Maywood should focus on having a smaller market, whether it be fresh produce market, where the margins or the revenues that you would need to hit are smaller, where maybe you have 10 employees versus 40, 50, where the store, where the square footage is 3,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet versus 8,000, 10,000 square feet.
Yeah.
So we can build a case study of success where the village might be able to maintain. I think about something like a Sugar Beets in Oak Park, a co-op for instance,
Mhm.
where it's under a retail, it's this grocery store, which is kind of like a hybrid convenience store, grocery store, not quite full service, but you can get fresh produce, you can get locally grown, and you can get local items there. It has reasonable prices, but it's in a smaller footprint and doesn't need 300 people a day to sustain it.
Right.
Some of these grocery stores need a lot of foot traffic. And so you're just asking a lot of the consumer in 2026 to do that. And once you can sustain that, then you can grow. Now you have a case study for these larger grocery stores to feel like there is an ability to sustain. You have people coming to the village and getting used to shopping in the village. If you bite off more than you can chew, not saying that this is necessarily that case, but it's something just to consider from an economic development perspective. You want to have a regional appeal. And there's a few things in the village that have regional appeals, and they're working well, but it's still a tough business, especially in the food industry where things have a very quick shelf life, especially if they're fresh. And that's what the community is demanding, fresh produce. So I know in some ways that's not what people want to hear. I hear a lot about what the community deserves. And we do deserve fresh produce. And people have access to that. It's just not right next door. Right. But from a economic development perspective, from a capitalistic consumer perspective and what people are willing to invest in, it's just a different conversation. And we have to understand where we are in the market and make good strategic decisions and think not just short term, but 5, 10, 20 years down the line.
Bingo. The strategic plan, as you know, is essential in the present as well as the future. The short term, midterm, and long term goals. You said a lot, Trustee Jones, and I agree with everything you're saying. The retail, particularly the grocery industry, it's totally different now than it was 4 years ago. It's totally different. The profit margin is so much smaller now. It's very small. Having a full grocery store, it costs more to run than it does in terms of how much money you make from that. And you mentioned the top 5 grocers. You know this because your background is in corporate America business. Number 1 and number 5, as you know, was owned by the same family, the Walton family. Mm-hmm. So Walmart, Sam Walton, Sam's Club, founded by Sam Walton. And so, I'm no conspiracy theorist, but, when you have the number 1 and number 5, it kind of goes to being an oligopoly, right? A few has control of everything. And you see a threat to someone entering into that market, you're going to throw some curveballs in there to prevent things happening. I'm not suggesting that's what happened in Maywood because it was a failed partnership between Kroger and Albertson, but it's much deeper than people making comments on social media talking about we need a grocery store because it's failed. I'm sure you've seen the comments, they failed because Maywood failed. No, this is way bigger. It's way deeper than what happened in Maywood. But I also want to ask you, how are we doing with having a plan? Because I don't want to continue seeing, hey, let's try this, let's try that. And I'm not saying that the board is having that low-level conversation, but for me, from somebody who's an economic professor and teach economics from an IB global perspective, it seemed like we're throwing darts on the wall, hoping it sticks, and you guys are way more intelligent than that. So I know better, but what it appears as though it's like, we're going to do this. Oh, don't worry about it. Kroger left. We're just going to replace it. What happened in Aldi's a few years ago? Aldi's came and they left for whatever reason. Kroger's came and they left for another reason. And I think the only way to increase the opportunity of staying power is a strategic plan that will tackle the economic development as well as the deficit that Maywood face. So you can tell me from your perspective if you agree or not. Definitely add on if you do agree, because you're the expert when it comes to, the municipality and the economics of running the government.
Yeah, I would say I agree there's just nuance to a plan. So the strategic plan that you're talking about, or the vision, is a document that we update, which basically speaks to the fabric of our community. It speaks to the map and the best use of our land. And so we'll have goals, objectives. Normally you hire some professionals to come in to help you create a goals or ideals. And then that's how you're able to, once you have interests in your community, to keep you on, not pivoting per se, right? Because normally you get buy-in from the community, you're getting buy-in from residents and other business owners, investors, etc. The nuance that I would say with that, and what adds value, is the strategic plan has to be revisited as the economy shifts. It also has to reflect on not just our ideals, but what is your brand amongst the region. So our strategic plan could say, we want Mariano's to come to the village, or
Right.
we want Whole Foods.
Right.
Now, it's a relationship, right? So I might want Rihanna, or I might want whoever is a very popular, Beyonce, whoever. They have to want me. They have to be available.
Right.
It has to be mutual.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one thing to say what you want. It's one thing to say what communities like you have done. We've even seen in Chicago, I think on the South Side, there was a Whole Foods that came. And that's a huge city. And it doesn't always work out, because it's also about, it's a free market. It's private owners. Mm-hmm. So I do think the strategic plan has to be coupled with effective staff, has to be coupled with state support, federal support. The community has to also buy into. The community has to make a commitment and say, we need to spend locally. They have to incorporate that into their budgets.
Yeah.
That's tough to say when people lose their jobs. That's tough to do when costs for medicine goes up and those budgets shrink. That's tough to do when you have ICE out in your community, and you have a predominant, you have a large Hispanic population, and they're nervous to go outside. They're nervous to invest in your community. And I'm speaking broadly, but those things might not have been in the strategic plan 5, 10, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I say all that to say, you need a foundation, you need a plan, you have to be nimble, you have to be flexible, and you have to have expertise. And you have to lean on that expertise. Mm-hmm. And it has to be a community support, but it also needs to also have a regional appeal. I think that's critical in all this. Yeah. And that's where safety comes in. That's where infrastructure comes in. That's where beautification efforts, et cetera. So it's somewhat of a circular equation as it relates to what you need for all that to work out. But we are in an area where we see some success, and by our neighbors, even though it's not completely apples to oranges. For instance, Merrill's Park has North Avenue, and Oak Park has right next to Harlem, and right next to Austin, Lake Street, and et cetera. So it's somewhat apples to oranges. These are larger communities, whether it be land-wise or in some ways more affluent, higher earners, more equity, et cetera. So different culture. Mm-hmm. So yes, you're right. And that is something that the community needs to expect, but then also there's just nuance involved where we just can't completely lean on that, because it's just as good as a piece of paper unless it's active, and you need buy-in from the board, from staff, from the community, from the region, and to really make that successful.
Indeed, I agree. You mentioned economies of scale, which is running an organization or entity efficiently that will result in lower unit costs or lower costs per unit as opposed to running inefficiently, which means unit cost goes higher. So in terms of running efficiently, you still have, like you said, you still have resources, you still have assets and things like that. It's not the end of the world because of what happened with Kroger. I get all that. But in terms of the responsibility as an elected official. What's the responsibility of elected official to inform residents about these major economic challenges or economic changes that affect the community in totality?
Well, our job is to keep the residents, the investors in our town, the property tax, people that own property and are investors or people that constituents, et cetera, abreast to what's going on and letting them know what plans that we have. So 19th of Maywood Drive, a tenant left, and we need staff and we need the village to stay on top of that to make sure that the unfortunate situation doesn't get worse. But that's only, Maywood is 21 blocks. So we also need to be focusing on what's happening on like areas like First and Lake, ensuring that something like a Walgreens doesn't leave. And I'm not saying that they are not, but there have been, a lot of these major retailers have been closing, and understanding that, we can help or whatever we could do to help support those entities. Burger King never came back. And, that's unfortunate because from a sales tax perspective,
Right.
they brought in a lot of money, also jobs. Also, they took advantage of the traffic that goes down, that major interstate that we call First Avenue, that turns into Cumberland, that turns into a, interstate. So we have to look at Maywood in totality and understand that we need to understand or maximize our return on investment. And so a lot of this land that the village owns, we don't want to own, because if we go back to our strategic plan, it's meant for private investment. It's meant to generate tax revenue. Going back to 19th and Maywood Drive, I heard a lot of conversations about, or discussions online about, well, let's convert it to a youth center. The village should purchase that building and turn it into a youth center. Well, that sounds good, right?
Right.
So we would have to, that building now is not worth $10,000. It's not going to sell it to us for $10,000.
Right.
We would have to decommission that building, invest in it becoming a recreational center, and we wouldn't generate any property taxes from it.
Right.
So it would be a liability now. And then we would have to assume that the village would pay whatever cost it would take to operate it, the fees that we have to charge for even residents and non-residents to participate in it. So, no idea is a bad idea, but from my perspective and from what that area is zoned for, that's not the best use. The best use is to have it be, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be some sort of private ownership, where we're taking advantage of the fact that is, that area is really close to where you can get to the E-way. You can get to the surrounding suburbs quickly. It's right next to a park where if we remove some of those, nuisance, we have adults out there drinking at that park, which is unnecessary.
Yeah.
But that also impacts the desirability of a business wanting to move there. Can they utilize and see themselves in the community? Can they go over and have corporate events at that park? Can they, bring their kids and et cetera to that park? Can they see themselves living in that town? So, ultimately, our responsibility, as it always has been, is to ensure that we have a return on investment in these areas. And a lot of that has to do with public and private partnership. But there's only so much tax incentive money that we can give, and that actually makes sense.
Right.
Because residents don't get tax incentives or, tax breaks. Now, our seniors do. There are things that individuals do qualify for if they own a home, and they should get those things. But generally speaking, we have to pay our full property tax liability. So in order to be fair, we have to be very cognizant and thoughtful about who we're giving these incentives to and projecting and forecasting that they're going to be in the village for a long time.
Do you have any candidates that are interested in taking over that space right now? Can you speak on that, or is that still something that is a discussion?
Yeah, I think it's a little too early to know. I think that's something that Kroger just left. Let's say January 31st or February 1. I'm sure they still need to decommission.
Okay.
I think the first steps is for village staff and the mayor or whoever to be meeting and connecting with the owner and understanding what their steps are. Just, similar if you own an apartment building, the village only has so much pull in what that owner would want to do. So it's really about what we don't want to happen is for us to have a owner that we can't reach that's looking to take out some sort of, pull the equity out of it and just go missing, right?
Right.
That
you live in Arizona or something like that, nowhere around to be.
Right. So what you want to do is make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Making sure that they feel comfortable that they can pay the property taxes for the next few years, help to facilitate, private business. So I'm assuming that owner, that developer is going to be reaching out to other developers and real estate people, the Kings of the world and some of these other major people that work in these type of spaces to help facilitate those type of conversations.
Yes.
The village's job is to make sure or to ensure that property doesn't go vacant too long.
Right.
And that we're responsible for, because as I mentioned, we probably collect, upwards of more than $200,000 a year for that property. That's equivalent to, let's say the average property taxer in Maywood, property tax homeowner pays $7,000 to $10,000 a year in property taxes. We're talking about 25 homes.
Yeah.
So that's a huge hit. So that's going to be important. I think, as we're looking into development such as this at the former golf range.
Oh yeah.
Sustainability.
Yeah.
And making sure that we feel comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
And if they understand that the community, what you don't want to do is pull the rug underneath the community. Right. And so that's where due diligence is really important. I know that there's a planning and zoning board meeting tomorrow I believe it starts at 6 or 7 at council chambers. The community needs to be there asking questions. I would challenge those commissioners to be asking questions, to critique, to understand, to poke holes in it, just to make sure this is solid. The same thing, that's happening with the grocery store.
Trustee Jones, I'm sorry. I just want to parenthetically pause to get poke holes. It seemed like any time where there's a public comment that's made during the meetings, the mayor, he has a rebuttal. It's like an argument. And I can't speak for residents, but it just appears to me that it's almost confrontational. Like it becomes combative sometimes. And so you're not the mayor and you can't speak for the mayor, but to me, to what you're saying, being transparent, if it's important to you, shouldn't it be important to the entire board, including the mayor? Not saying he's not listening, but I'm just saying if it's something he doesn't like, he doesn't hear or agree with, he has a rebuttal. And it's not about that. Is it?
Well, we all have our perspectives. We all have our talents. I come from an accounting risk management perspective. So I'm looking at what's the worst that could happen. There's individuals that come from like a sales or a consultant perspective,
right?
Where they're just looking at closing on a deal and looking at addressing citizen concerns. So in a lot of ways, I think there is a lot of enthusiasm to get things done, just to say we did it, right? Hey, you wanted to see a grocery store, I'm just gonna get it done.
Right.
And you say you want this, I'm just gonna get it done.
Right.
Almost being very literal with it. And I understand that because, you can go on any Maywood Facebook group or whatever, and they say, we need a grocery store. We need a grocery store. You just get tired of hearing it. And so for some people, it's like, all right, I'm going to just get it done. And, if it doesn't survive, then it's on y'all. And
Right.
that's in our roles, we can't be that short-sighted, or we can't be that literal. We have to, we have a different role. And so my role or my perspective, although I want these, it's great to hear about business owners and corporations that are interested in investing in Maywood, but just by virtue of things being vacant doesn't mean that they're entitled to our land just because we haven't had investment. That this land has been vacant for 15 years, so take what you can get.
Right.
We have to act like we've been here before. We still have to have poise. We still have to have integrity because we're using taxpayers' money. It's not our money.
Right.
And quite frankly, if it was, I think we would be a lot more critical.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
But with that being said, again, I can't speak for the mayor and how he responds, but I do think the entire board needs to be engaged and asking questions and being constructively critical.
Yeah.
From the perspective of, we want this to work, and we want people to know that we take our communities and our states and our federal resources seriously.
Yeah.
And I would say this, and making sure that we're following up on the work that our staff is doing. Are they doing the proper due diligence? We're their boss at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I feel very confident that the Village of Oak Park, the Village of Merrill's Park, Schaumburg, Oak Brook, they're critical too.
Oh yeah.
They're just not going to let anything in their community. So we, just by virtue of us being, I guess, under invested or Black and brown community doesn't mean that our standards should lower.
Right.
By virtue of us being in need. At least that's not my role to do that. I understand the commentary and the audience might speak or feel otherwise, but that isn't my role.
Yeah. You're watching the podcast, Let's Talk Maywood and Diversity Today Media. We have hit the 1 hour mark. As you can see, Trustee Jones and I are engaged in very diplomatic and deep conversations, and we could go for another hour, but we're not. We're going to cut this in a few minutes. And again, I appreciate you taking time as always to come on our podcast to, just to clear a lot of things up and your transparency. We always appreciate. I wanted to ask you, and thanks for answering that question about the comments part. You mentioned transparency. So when it comes to that, what economic factors? And I want to shift gears. I want to shift gears to the deficit part. I don't know where we are now as far as the deficit, but I assume it's less than what it was last time we talked because you're working on 2026. Terry, what happened to Trustee Jones? Oh, there you go. So you're working on the 2026 budget. So how transparent are you with the community as it relates to the challenges, the fiscal challenges that the board face for the village?
Well, there's two things going on. We'll have to pass a budget for fiscal year 2026, 2027, no later than April. So a presentation should be happening no later than March as far as the initial preliminary budget. And as it relates to our audits, we are still outstanding as it relates to our fiscal year 2024, 2025 audit, whether it be TIF or general fund. And, that has to do, and that'd be a whole nother conversation, but we have our interim village manager, Lanye Satchel, also, managing our finance department and kind of leading the charge from staff. So she has her hands full, but I do know that Baker Tilly is our auditors, and we should be wrapping that up shortly. From my understanding, our auditors will be have been invited to our board retreat that's happening February 28th in the village. So I'm going to invite the community to be in tune for that and to hear what our auditors have to say. So that's where we are from a transparent perspective. We have made a lot of strides, but from my standards perspective, we're still behind, and that's not good enough. So I can't speak to it exactly how well we've done from where our current deficit is. That's where you want the auditors to kind of also speak to that. But we have decreased since I've been on the board, our deficit has decreased. So I would say good news, but, also we want to, also keep the community abreast of what's happening currently.
Very good. I appreciate that. Just a couple more questions. I want to ask you about the question that was posed by Miss Eileen Olivier, talking about the empty space now where the Kroger Fulfillment Center was, and filling that space possibly with the youth detention center. I guess there were conversations about using that space for a youth detention center. That's a lot of space though for a youth detention center. But here in Prince William County, we do have a youth detention center that's pretty massive. But is there a discussion with that? And then I want to ask you in that same vein, part two of my question about, you mentioned ICE before. Where do we look? What is the village leadership doing in terms of protecting the citizens from another ICE infiltration, if you will, as it relates to Maywood specifically, aside from what Mayor Thompson was doing in Broadview and, Mayor Harvey was doing in Bellwood?
Yeah, that's a great question. From my understanding, the Broadview detention center or that ICE facility, I believe, is not private property. The space, if we're talking about the former Kroger fulfillment center, is private property. And so to the degree in which that landlord would have to make some sort of agreement with the federal government, I suppose they could be doing that. I think that's something where we would need to be abreast. I think what we can make some sort of commitment to is an extra having policy in place around, we're very limited. Unfortunately, we're very limited in terms of what we can and cannot do. But I do think we could be very unique as it relates to ensuring that those type of spaces aren't close to schools, churches, other public facilities. Right. And learning from what Mayor Thompson did in Broadview, I think that's a fair question and something that I can bring back to staff and to the board at our retreat. But my suspicion is that I don't think that's, Maywood is being targeted for a youth detention center. That has not been brought to my attention, although I know there has been an ICE sighting in the village, I believe at the Shell gas station. So I am aware of that. To the degree in which they need another detention center or a facility, just, which would be pretty much neighboring Broadview. From a national perspective, I don't think I've seen that or have heard of that. So more to come on that. That's the best answer that I have now, but the board's response would be able to, work with our attorneys to come up with solutions to help protect our residents, our vulnerable residents. Okay.
So I was going to ask you, sorry, one last question. In terms of ICE, everyone knows, the whole world knows what happened in Minneapolis. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate your transparency about not having a solid solution to that. But as far as protecting the citizens, how can we prevent something like that happening in Maywood? ICE come in, if they were to come in, to wreak havoc. Even though there's been discussions at Congress and everything about them changing, they're trying to pass the budget, for mm-hmm. ICE, but then the Democrats say no, you can't wear a mask anymore. You want body cameras and all that. How is that? Do you see that happening in Maywood as far as them coming in, infiltrating like they did in Minneapolis or other blue states, blue cities? And if that happens, what would the protection be? Where would that protection come from? Would it come from the police? Would it come from the state? Mm-hmm. How would that look?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a tough question. I think it's really about learning from what we've seen in Minneapolis. I believe in a lot of ways these ICE agents are untrained and are committing crimes. So what you can do to prevent crimes at the federal level is very tough, especially when the Department of Justice is essentially in on it and promoting this, and so is the President of the United States. I think what I would tell residents is to peacefully protest. I would tell residents to be cognizant of any excuse someone could use to label you as promoting violence or uh, being a agent of chaos. Which again, I think that has to do with make sure you are recording. That's why ring doorbells are important. To the degree in which you're protesting, keep it peaceful. Be cognizant if you are someone that has a license to like a 40 card. Be cognizant of those type of things, because we saw, unfortunately, that gentleman, I believe his first name was Alex. He had he had a right to conceal and carry, and even though he didn't use that weapon, it seems like that was an avenue to create stories, and also be cognizant of the fact that there are people that are promoting this type of behavior, and so they'll edit a video and show you doing something that you're not, and so there is no perfect solution. I think we do need to support our residents and support our vulnerable, but we have to do it in a peaceful way. We have to encourage others to be peaceful, and continue to also, we're going to need support not only just from the local police, but also from the state level. That's where our state officials are important. Our county officials are important. I think when you're dealing with the federal government and then, I think that's where the courts also are important too. In my eyes, a lot of this is unlawful and also an abuse of power. So it's a fight from many angles. And so, my answer is just to be, just do your due diligence, be thoughtful, and protect yourself at all times.
Thank you very much for that, sir. Appreciate it. Yeah, the two citizens who were murdered was April Good and Alex Preddy. So you're right, Alex Preddy, on the 24th of January. So this is time well spent. Trustee Jones, really appreciate you again joining our podcast as always. And I want to give you a moment, a couple minutes, if you'd like to talk about anything that's going on recently, or if there's something like you like to say to your constituents at this time. By all means, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you again, Lex Talk Maywood and Terrence and Dr. Ratliff for having me on. I just want to say, one, happy Black History Month. Despite what's going on in our community, let's make sure we're taking a moment to be celebratory, to remember the past, and make sure that we're putting our best foot forward for the future. I am hosting a community discussion, a lunch and learn at Meal of the Day Cafe starting at noon. Let's continue these conversations. It'll be starting at noon at Meal of the Day Cafe. For individuals in the community that would like to come and meet me there, I'll be there for about an hour and a half discussing topics like this, discussing meetings that are happening in the community. For example, the Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals will be looking at the special use permit for the 30 West Madison golf driving range. I want to encourage residents to attend. As I mentioned, I'll be having a lunch and learn, which is going to be sponsored by myself and also the Task Force for Council Manager Form of Government. We are still, encouraging our residents to stay engaged and involved in our government. I also want to encourage our residents to participate in elections that will be happening soon in March for a bunch of seats, whether it be at the county and state level. But I think some of the big races are for Congress, and former seats of Danny K. Davis and Senator Dick Durbin, amongst others. So please do your research. Please participate. It's important that the village of Maywood makes our voices heard. So that's what I would like to leave you all with, that I'm here to help. I am a voice. I refuse to be intimidated by bullies or people that are looking to completely control the narrative. My job is to be a voice of the people that elected me. So I will continue to do that, and I'll continue to do that with confidence and pride. It's been one of the best honors of my life to represent you all, and I'm going to continue to do that. So for the folks that can come out tomorrow, again, Middle of the Day Cafe located in the Eisenhower Tower. I'll be there at noon, and I'll be there for an hour and a half for individuals that can make it. If you can't make it, I will be dropping a Zoom link for those that like to attend virtually. But let's stay engaged. This is not the time to be on the sidelines. It's going to take some courage, but we're going to get through this together.
Thank you, Trustee Jones. Really appreciate you joining our podcast this evening. He said something that was critical. Vote, stay engaged, be active. This is an election where we need to vote like our life depended on it. Early voting is on March 2nd through the 16th, and voting day is on March 17th. And so please get out there and vote. And so every vote counts. And so get out there to know where the poll is, where you need to report to vote, and please vote like your life depends on it. I want to do a quick memoriam to remember two people who were instrumental in my life. First, my classmate, Arleta Crawford. Arleta and I've known Arleta since our days back at Garfield. She was an outstanding student. She was an outstanding student athlete. At Garfield, she played softball, ran track, and played volleyball. At Proviso East, I think she did volleyball and track as well. And so, may she rest in eternal peace. Condolences to her family. Much love to the Garfield family, everyone who knew her in the village, township, Proviso Township, and Illinois and nationwide. Arleta was a very, very nice person, very sweet soul, and she will be deeply missed. The other person is my sister-in-law, Dodie Ratliff. She passed away just a couple of days ago. Knew her practically my entire life. I first met her at a Proviso West basketball tournament, crystal tournament, when I was real young, maybe fourth grade. Couldn't find out that she kept giving me free popcorn and pop. I was like, why is this girl giving me free stuff all the time? Couldn't find out she was my brother's girlfriend, Onion. So knew her for many years. They were married for 42 years. So she died peacefully, surrounded by her family and friends. And so condolences to my brother, Onion. Please keep her in prayer. Maywood, everybody knew who Dodie was. Very loved, very beloved. And she would be deeply, deeply missed by my family. So, look at the funeral arrangements for both Arleta and Dodie, and please attend if you can. So with that said, I am your host, Dr. Reggie Ratliff. Thank you for tuning in. Please stay tuned for our next podcast. Like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube. Until next time, God bless you, be safe, and good night. Peace.